Welcome to Healthy Mama Hacks, a weekly mini podcast where I share my best tips for hacking your healthy mama life with simple tips for easier eating, cooking, and living a healthy mama life in 20-ish minutes, about the time it takes you to fold a load of laundry. So let's do this, mama.
Got soup.
It's soup season. Let's chat about how to hack making super satisfying, super flavorful soup from scratch. I know it is super easy just to pop open a can of soup and pour it into a saucepan and heat it on up, but there is nothing like homemade soup, stew, chili. Anything in soup form is my absolute favorite in the fall and the winter time, but I know it can be kind of intimidating making soup from scratch, especially making flavorful soups from scratch. So today I want to give you some of my best tips for making your soup stand out. Whether you are creating something yourself or you're following someone else's recipe, I want to share with you some of my best tips for making really delicious soup. And of course, I will include a printable list of my favorite soups. So you can click on any of those recipes in the show notes. So go ahead and head to the show notes and you can get a whole bunch of my favorite soups. But let's take a minute to just chat about soup for a second. There are two main types of soup. There are thick soups and there are thin soups. There's also cold soups like gazpacho, but we're not going to go there today. We're going to talk about those really hearty, hot soups that are what we find most of the time in the fall and the winter time. Within these two main types of soup, thick soups and thin soups, there is a really large variety of soups. But the most common types of soup are, for thin soups, broth-based soups. These are usually either based on a broth that's like a vegetable broth or a meat broth like a beef broth or a chicken broth or a turkey broth, sometimes a seafood broth as well, a bouillon-based broth, or a consommé. And a consommé is a double-strained broth, kind of like you find in Vietnamese pho broth. And it's also found in some different French applications as well. But most of the time, broth-based soups we make are usually made with some sort of stock or some sort of broth. And then there are a whole variety of thick soups. So there are cream soups. So think of like cream of mushroom soup and cream of asparagus soup. There are puree soups. So if you think of like pureed butternut squash soup, pureed sweet potato soup. And then there are chowders, and chowders are most often cream-based, but these are soups that are almost veering on a stew. They are usually really thick and hearty. Oftentimes they have some really hearty starchy ingredients like corn or potatoes or both. And then there is Bisque. And Bisque soups are traditionally made from a seafood base. So think lobster bisque, but now sometimes there are kind of vegetable-based bisques as well. And then there's also a velouté-based soup, and you actually use a velouté for that soup, and that's like a French-based soup. And I honestly have not made one since culinary school, so I felt like I needed to mention it, but most of us are not making velouté soups, I don't think, in your house. So main categories, broth-based soups, and then your thicker soups, so cream soups, puree soups, chowders, bisques. No matter what type of soup you make, though, you can make all of them delicious and more satisfying just by understanding a couple things. Number one, what is the outcome that you're going for? Are you going for a soup that is more broth-based, like a chicken soup or a vegetable soup or a minestrone? Are you going for a more thick soup? So are you doing a cream of soup or a pureed soup or a chowder or a bisque, which is somewhere in between? Like, it's not broth-based, it's more cream-based, but it's definitely thinner than like your pureed soup or your cream soup. So what are you going for with your soup? And then what are the main ingredients you want to use? Starting from there, okay, what is the outcome you're looking for? What are the main ingredients you want to use? And then you can start to build that soup from the ground up. So the first thing you need to do to build that delicious soup Or the first thing that you need to look at in the recipe for the soup that you're looking at is, what is the star of your soup? What do you want the main ingredient that stands out from your soup to be? Now, all components of a soup are important. They're all going to work together to make a soup that is really satisfying and really delicious. But what is the star going to be? If it's chicken soup, the star is the chicken. If it is cream of mushroom soup, the star is the mushrooms. Maybe it's a bean-based soup, and so then the star is the beans. For soup, it's a little bit different than when you are creating a meal where the star is oftentimes the protein. Sometimes for a soup, the star is the protein, and sometimes it's a vegetable, like with butternut squash soup. So what is the main ingredient that you want to stand out? What are you focusing on enhancing the flavor of and balancing the flavor of within your soup? So number one, decide on your base. Is it going to be a broth-based soup, a cream-based soup, a puree soup? And then what is the star? What is that main ingredient that is going to go in this soup? Once you're there, or once you've decided what that main ingredient is within the soup recipe that you're going to make, or what kind of soup it is you're going to make, then you can start building your soup. The first most important part of your soup when you are starting to build it is the aromatics. For most French-based soups, this is your mirepoix, your carrots, celery, and onion. It's 2 parts onion, 1 part carrot, 1 part celery, and they're all diced the same size, usually a small dice. And you cook these up, you sweat them in oil or butter, or a combination of oil and butter, which is my preference because it increases the smoke point of the butter. Or in Italian cooking, this is a sofrito. And sofrito isn't just for soup. Sofrito is also for sauces and things like that. But these are the aromatics. The aromatics do contribute to the overall flavor of the soup. They are the kind of the baseline flavor of the soup. They're really important. This is also the time that you would add in the garlic or the ginger, but you want to make sure you're sweating those carrot, celery, and onion first. Sweating is releasing some of that liquid, allowing that to evaporate and allowing those vegetables to cook down. Usually we say cook until translucent, so they're starting to be see-through and soft. It is important that they are releasing their flavors. When they start to soften, it means that they are starting to release their flavors. So we don't want to dump everything into the soup right away. We want to give each one of the ingredients time to develop. We want those flavors to develop. So don't rush with your soup. Sweat that carrot, celery, and onion, the mirepoix or the sofrito. And I didn't mention sofrito is usually much, much smaller dice. Some people will even process it in a food processor. And then the garlic or ginger if you're using, but as most of you know, garlic or ginger, you don't want to be in the pan for too long or at too high a heat because it can very easily burn or stick, and that is going to change the flavor of your soup in a negative way. So you want to make sure you're turning down the heat, or you are stirring really well when you put that in and you're not letting that burn. So you want to let these cook before moving on. So you're always starting with a base of your aromatics. The next thing that you want to consider is the body of your soup. And that is the main ingredient or the main ingredients of your soup. If it's a vegetable soup, there might be several main ingredients. Remember, we already figured out what is the star, okay? What are you kind of working this soup around? But if it's something like a chicken soup, then maybe you are including the chicken in there, and then maybe it's a chicken noodle soup. So you also want to add in some pasta, or maybe it's a chicken and rice soup. And so you're going to want to add in some rice or some wild rice. As an aside, you always want to cook your pasta or your rice separately and add it in at the end. It absorbs a ton of liquid, and it can oftentimes make the soup kind of thick and starchy and like require a situation where where the rice and the pasta tends to get kind of oversaturated with water. They also tend to take quite a long time to cook. Each one is different. Obviously, pasta cooks a lot quicker than rice in most cases. So it might not have the outcome you want. So I always recommend cooking those separately and adding in at the end. But what are those main ingredients, okay? We don't want to just add everything in at once, like I mentioned before. How can you enhance those main ingredients with the most flavor possible? So if you are putting chicken in for your chicken soup, okay, make sure that the chicken that you're putting in is chicken that's been cooked and seasoned, right? You haven't just poached it on the stove. You might poach it on the stove, but maybe you poached it in some broth, or you poached it in water with a good pinch of sea salt, or maybe some aromatic herbs. You can do a bouquet garni like you would put in with your broth, and that is just herbs tied together that you add in when you're poaching that chicken. Every part of your soup matters. So how can you just enhance that a little bit? If you're making a butternut squash soup, instead of adding it in and just letting the butternut squash cook with the rest of the soup, what if you roast it ahead of time? That's going to make a world of difference when you are allowing that butternut squash, those sugars in the butternut squash to caramelize. It's going to make it a little bit sweeter, a little bit heartier. So delicious. So how can you enhance those main ingredients a little bit? And then also really important with the body of the soup is remembering that mouthfeel matters. So if you're adding vegetables to your soup, you want to make sure that those vegetables are easy to enjoy. Okay, they are probably going to shrink down a little bit as you cook them, but you want them all to be around the same size, and you want them to be bite-sized. You want them to easily fit in the mouth of somebody who is putting that soup on a spoon and enjoying it. If you've ever eaten a soup with giant pieces of potato in it that you have to cut with your spoon before you eat it, it tends to be an imbalance of the broth or whatever the base is to that vegetable. And the ideal soup will have a mix of all of the ingredients in pretty much every bite. So making sure what you're putting in is bite-sized and everything is around the same size is going to make a difference in how satisfying that soup is. It seems like a small detail, but it is actually a really big detail. So you've decided on your base and your main ingredients. You're figuring out what the star of your soup is and what outcome you're looking for. Then you are adding in your aromatics, you're sweating them, you are cooking them before you add anything else, including your garlic or ginger, which you're putting in at the end, making sure you're not burning. Then you're adding in the main ingredients, the body, and you're looking into how you can add the most flavor possible out of each one of the ingredients. It's also an important time to add that we want to make sure that we are seasoning as we go. Like I mentioned, seasoning that chicken before you put it into the chicken soup. You're seasoning your vegetables. I always add a pinch of salt to my mirepoix. This helps to release some of that water from the vegetables and helps it to cook and helps that sweating to happen a little bit quicker. So now it's time to build our flavor, right? We are seasoning as we go. We're making sure we're seasoning each one of the ingredients. It's really, really important that you are seasoning at the beginning of cooking, especially when you are adding in dried herbs. All dried herbs should be added at the beginning of cooking because they need time to rehydrate and release their flavor. So we're seasoning as we go so that each one of our ingredients within the soup is seasoned, and we're adding our dry herbs right after we add those main ingredients, typically even before you add the broth, because you want time for those flavors to open up. You really need to make sure that you're cooking your soup long enough. I think one of the biggest mistakes I see when people are making soups and they're feeling like it's too bland is adding in, is either not seasoning as you go, adding in herbs at the end and feeling like it tastes like a bit bitter, or not letting it cook long enough so those flavors really develop. When you are building flavor within your soup, you should probably already have an idea of what you're looking for when it comes to flavor, because you've already figured out the star of your soup. You've probably decided what sort of cuisine you want to be going for, and you're adding in herbs and aromatics based on that cuisine. But I don't want you to forget about the 3 foundations of flavor: taste, texture, and temperature. Okay, we already talked about texture. Temperature we'll talk about a little bit more in a little bit, because right now we're focusing on the hot part of the soup, but we can definitely add in some different temperature as well as we go. We talked about texture when it comes to mouthfeel. It's important that we remember the 5 tastes: sweet, sour, bitter, salty, and umami. If everything in your soup has a sweet flavor to it, your soup's going to be a little bit too sweet. So how can we contrast that a little bit? Make sure that we're adding some salt to our butternut squash soup. How can we add something umami to it to bring in a little bit of that umami flavor? Even just a hint of cream can really make a difference when you're making a soup that might be like a squash soup that's a little bit sweet, okay? And that can really balance that out a little bit, making sure that there's enough salt in there. Bringing in some more savory ingredients or bitter ingredients, so herbs like sage or thyme can help to contrast that a little bit and bring a little bit of that savory flavor into that. In soups that feel like they need a little bit of something and you can't quite tell what it is, oftentimes a little bit of acid, a little bit of sour will help to balance that out. Before you add extra salt at the end of a soup, it's really important to try a little bit of acid first. So a little bit of lemon juice or lime juice, that can make a huge difference when it comes to your soup. And then adding your base, okay? So we already decided what our base is. Is it a broth-based soup? Is it a cream-based soup? If it is a cream-based soup or a pureed soup, oftentimes cream-based soups are also pureed, then at this point, you're probably going to want to add a little bit of broth. Cook it until all of the vegetables are softened. Transfer it to your blender or your food processor or use an immersion blender. Blend that up, and then you're going to go ahead and add in your cream there. But at this point, you're typically always going to add some sort of a broth. I don't recommend cooking your soup with water, like ever. Just please don't, because it will change the flavor. The base that you choose for your soup makes a huge difference. The broth makes a difference. I cannot stress that enough. The broth is adding the vast majority of flavor within your soup. So make sure you choose a broth that you enjoy, that you would sip. So a couple of my favorite broths. First and foremost is homemade. I make homemade chicken broth often in the wintertime. And like I mentioned in my episode when I talked about our family favorites, I love making a whole chicken in the slow cooker, saving those bones, and then making broth. I have a whole kind of picture tutorial on my website about how I make homemade chicken broth. Make it in the slow cooker. You can also do it in the Instant Pot. It is super, super easy. So I will link that as well with the soup recipes in the show notes. Homemade is great. You can take your homemade broth and change the flavoring based on whatever herbs you add to it. If you want to add garlic, if you want to add pepper, if you want to add thyme or sage, or you could even add herbs like rosemary and really change the flavor of it. Remember that those herbs are going to serve as the base of your soup though. So if you made a rosemary based broth, then your soup is going to have some rosemary in it. So you might want to keep it simple with just maybe some garlic and parsley and thyme and garlic or something like that. But you can change the flavor of your broth as much as you want. Maybe you want to go a little bit more technical and make a beef broth where you roast the beef bones and you add in that tomato paste and those vegetables, and then you make a broth out of that. Super delicious. Or a stock out of that. Really delicious. But it's totally up to you. If you don't want to make your own homemade, chicken broth is the only one, honestly, that we make homemade on a regular basis. If you don't want to make homemade, then find one at the store that you really enjoy that's going to serve as a really good base. I have some Tetra Pak soups that I do enjoy. I really like just the classic organic chicken broth from Trader Joe's. My absolute favorite chicken broths, or not chicken broths, my favorite broths are by the Epic brand. You might know Epic from their snacks. They have like meat-based snack bars and these really delicious pork rinds that my husband and I like basically fight over because they don't stay in our house long enough. They're super good. My kids like them too. But they actually came out with a line of broths, I want to say a couple years ago. And it took me a little while to try them because they do come in pretty small jars. And I was like, is it worth the price? And then I tried them. And I would drink these like tea in the afternoon. And I have. If I'm not feeling great and my throat's feeling a bit scratchy, that's the one that I will go for because they are so flavorful. There's a turkey one that is perfect for anything that has kind of like Thanksgiving type flavors to it. It's a turkey cranberry. And then their chicken broth is just bar none. It is so, so good. So I highly recommend them. I've worked with them as a partner in the past too. Just full disclaimer, we don't work on like long-term ongoing or anything like that. They're not sponsoring this podcast episode, but when they reached out, I was like, yes, because they're so good. So, your broth matters. So make sure it's a broth that you would sip, that you enjoy. Same goes for wine, by the way. Whenever you're adding wine to food, if you drink wine, if you're adding wine to food, the wine that you add to your food should be something that you would drink. If it's disgusting, it's going to make your food taste disgusting. So just an aside, it's important. The ingredients you put into your meals matter when it comes to flavor. Next thing that's really important, okay, after you've figured out the star of your soup, you've added those aromatics, the body, you're building the flavor, you've added your base. It's time to let your soup simmer, okay? Simmer, not boil. If you boil your soup at a really high rate, it's very common that a couple things might happen, okay? If you've got meat in your soup or your stew, the meat might cook quickly but not have time to allow those proteins to relax. And then the meat, did you all hear that? My step goal just went off on my running watch. Okay, back to what I was talking about. The meat will end up really tough, and oftentimes the vegetables will get super mushy if you boil it really fast and not have any shape left to them. So your goal is to cook the ingredients in your soup, but to have the outcome be really delicious and the mouth feel really good. So you want to allow enough time for your vegetables to cook and not get mushy, unless, of course, you are making a pureed soup. In that case, you can let them get as mushy as you want because you're just going to blend them. If you're using meat in your soup, then you want to make sure that it is cooked but tender as well. So you don't want to boil it, you want to simmer it. In fact, with pretty much any soup, the longer the simmer, the more flavorful the soup will become. If you simmer for a long time and you might need a little bit of extra liquid, just add liquid slowly, just like you're adding salt slowly, because you can't take it. Well, I guess you could take some of it away, but it's kind of hard to take it away, especially if you're going to puree it and then it becomes extra thin. You can always add, but it's hard to take away. And then oftentimes you don't want to take it away because it adds some of the flavor to it as well. So add a little bit of liquid at a time if you need more, but I would rather you add a little bit more liquid than not simmer long enough. So soups require time for those flavors to develop, so remember that. And then last but not least, okay, if your soup is done, it's ready to go. Maybe you're ready to go ahead and puree it to make a cream soup. It's really important to add your cream at the end. You don't want your soup to be boiling when you add your cream because even heavy cream, it can curdle. And if you are adding milk to your soup, you want to warm your milk first before you put it in the soup because that will definitely curdle. I mentioned before as well, this doesn't apply to cream-based soups, but for broth-based soups that feel a little flat, adding a little bit of acid, like a little bit of lemon juice, can really brighten up that soup. So now is the time to add in a little bit of acid. And then, yes, you can definitely season a little bit at the end if you haven't seasoned enough throughout. Taste your soup, season it to taste. You do not want to add any dry herbs at this point. This might be the point if you're using any greens. You can add your greens in and let them melt in, like spinach or kale. And you might want to season a little bit to make sure those are seasoned. The broth should do most of the work in seasoning. And that's, oh my gosh, that's an aside I forgot to make. Forgive me, please. When it comes to your broth, make sure you are paying attention to how much sodium is in your broth before you put a whole bunch of salt in your soup. You want to make sure that you are seasoning as you go. So that means they're just seasoning the different ingredients as you add them in. Then you're going to add your broth in, simmer, and taste before you add in a whole bunch of salt because it's very easy to oversalt a soup. And the only thing you can really do for an oversalted soup is just dilute it more, and that may or may not be the effect that you want. But as I mentioned, if you've already added salt to your soup and it still feels a little flat, try adding acid instead of adding more salt. And then last but not least, it's time to add your toppings. So remember taste, texture, and temperature, those foundations of flavor. We already have a hot soup, at least that's what we're talking about today. So you might want to add something cool on top to contrast that flavor. If it is a pureed soup, then you might want to add something on top like croutons or roasted nuts or some sort of a little crumble to add a little bit of a different texture to it. You might want to add a little bit of something salty, like adding some Parmesan on top of an Italian wedding soup or a minestrone. So just think about, what could this soup use to round it out a little bit, to round out the taste. Maybe we want something a little bit umami. Maybe we want something a little bit acidic. The texture, maybe we want something a little bit crunchy on top of that smooth soup. Or the temperature, maybe it's a spicy soup and you want a dollop of Greek yogurt on top of it. Or maybe you just want a swirl of some cream or some creme fraiche on top of it, something like that to balance out the to balance out the temperature. The other thing that can balance out some temperature a little bit is adding something cooling, like some cooling herbs like cilantro or mint to the top, if that fits in with your soup. So just consider those when you are finishing your soup and adding in those toppings as well. So let's do a quick little recap of how to make a super satisfying, super flavorful soup. You're going to want to decide on or identify your base, what type of outcome are you looking for in the soup, and your main ingredients, what is the star of your soup. You're going to add in those aromatics, you're going to sweat them, you're going to cook them before you add in anything else. Then you're going to add in the body of your soup. We're not just throwing in our ingredients. We're figuring out how we can add the most flavor to those ingredients before we're putting them in, remembering that mouthfeel matters. And so we are cutting our vegetables and our proteins to about the same size so they cook evenly and they feel good when you're eating them. If you're adding pasta or rice, you're adding that at the end. You're cooking them separately. Then you can start to build your flavor, your seasoning as you go. So adding a little bit of salt when you add each one of the ingredients, but not a ton. Remember that your broth probably, unless you're making it homemade, also has sodium in it, so not too much. Any dry herbs, you want to add those at the beginning. If you're adding fresh herbs, you add those at the end or on top. Don't forget those 3 foundations of flavor, taste, texture, and temperature, especially the 5 taste. So how can you balance out that taste? If you're tasting it and it feels like it needs a little something, you're going to want to make sure that you are adding in a base that is delicious, that you would sip. Your broth matters because it is the base to your soup. Then you're going to simmer your soup. You're not going to boil your soup. You're not going to try and kill your soup. It's already dead. You are going to simmer it low and slow. The longer the simmer, the more flavorful your soup will become. Then you can go ahead and season it to taste. If it feels a little flat, a little bland, try adding some acid to it before. So usually a citrus fruit juice. And then you can add a little bit of salt if you need to. Make sure you're stirring it and tasting it again each time, each addition of salt. And then if you're going to be pureeing it, add that cream at the end, whether you're pureeing it or not. Add that cream at the end and add it slowly, stirring as you go to avoid curdling. Warm your milk first before you add any sort of milk in to make sure that it doesn't curdle. And then just remember texture and temperature when it comes to toppings to round out your soup. So I hope you guys got some really awesome tips when it comes to making a really delicious and satisfying soup. If you have any questions on soup, you know where to find me over on Instagram at HealthyMamaChris. Don't forget to check the show notes to get a clickable list of my personal favorite soup recipes delivered to your inbox. And as always, I hope you enjoyed this episode of Healthy Mama Hacks. I would love to have you join us in the Healthy Balanced Mamas Facebook community. We do Friday coffee chats where we can chat about the things in these episodes or other topics you guys have chosen. That community is there for you. So I hope you guys have a wonderful soup season, and I'll catch you in the next episode. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Healthy Balanced Mama podcast. If you loved it, would you take a screenshot and share it with a friend over on Instagram and tag me in it? It helps me so much to know what you love and are taking away from each episode. If you really loved it, would you hop over to iTunes and give me a star rating and review? Every rating and review helps this podcast be seen and heard by more women who need to hear the message of balance and wellness without deprivation. It's the best free gift you could give me. And as a reminder, the information and opinions on this podcast are meant for education and inspiration only and are not to be taken as medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Please consult with a trusted practitioner before making any changes. Have a beautiful day, friend, and I'll see you in the next episode.